Good evening. My name is David Quick. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at DC Public Library. I'm very happy to welcome you to the West End Neighborhood Library for this special event with Thomas Mallon tonight. I want to thank the West End branch staff, especially the branch manager, Rob Schneider, and Mimi Nguyen, who's the adult librarian here, for helping us set up tonight. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, you didn't hear us playing Dick Coleman's lovely voice as we get started because he's the subject of the novel tonight. But I'm not going to go long. I'm just going to hand it over to our two speakers. Very happy to have Thomas Mallon here, who is a beloved member of the literary community here in Washington, D.C. His new book is really great, but you've probably read Fellow Travelers, Finale, Watergate, all the great historical fiction that he's written that's set right here in Washington, D.C., and probably see that his book, Fellow Travelers, is about to be a TV show. So that's very exciting. We're really looking forward to that. I look forward to hearing a little bit about the show tonight. Our friend Jamie Kirchick is going to interview him tonight. Jamie is most recently the author of Secret City, which, if you haven't read, is a terrific history of gay Washington, D.C. So I'm going to hand it over to them. Tom, congratulations on the book. Thank you for being here. Jamie, thanks for leading the conversation. Everyone, Jamie Kirchick and Tom Mallon.
There you go, the green light. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. So Tom Mallon, this is your 11th novel. And I have to say, it's about a man named Dick Coleman, who I had no idea who Dick Coleman was. I'm 39, so that might have something to do with it. But even, I know quite a bit of Hollywood history. I had to look this guy up. He seemed like quite an obscure figure, and you're someone who has written books about that have well-known, famous historical figures in them. He was quite obscure. I'm curious, what was it about Dick Coleman? Well, first of all, you should maybe explain who he is, because there might be some other people in the audience who don't know who Dick Coleman was. Who was he, and what was it about him that made you want to make him the centerpiece of your latest book?
Okay, Dick Coleman, I'm not sure he's really an object of gay pride, since he was not the nicest character around in real life. But he was born in 1933, and he had a career in show business that lasted for about 20 years. He started very young as a teenager on Broadway. He was in the musical version of 17. And he was in New York for most of the 50s. His big break came with the National Road Company production of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, which was a hugely successful musical in its day. He, of course, lost the movie to Robert Morse. He was always losing things to somebody who was just a little bit bigger, a little bit better. His big moment came in 1965 when he had a sitcom for 1 year that was called Hank. This was an era of really preposterous sitcoms. It was the same year that My Mother the Car premiered and died. Hank premiered and died. Coleman was supposed to play a college drop-in. There were lots of costumes and so forth. He would impersonate students he knew were going to be absent. He was so desperate to get an education. He was an orphan who was raising his little sister. The parents were dead, and he did all these odd jobs. And just for the pure love of learning, he would find out who was going to be absent and take their place and dress up. This was the most ridiculous premise. It lasted a year. The ratings were horrible. It was opposite the Wild Wild West, which hipper kids in junior high school, which I was in, were watching. And that was it. And there was very little left for him in show business. He did a lot of hour-long, episodes of hour-long dramas. He had a role in a couple of episodes as Little Louis Groovy in Batman. He played a villain that was loosely based on Phil Spector. And then he left. He left the business in early 1970s and went into the antiques business. And sold a lot of antiques, many of which were phony, with Dolores Gray, his business partner, who was this brassy musical star of the 40s and 50s. And then he was murdered in 1980 in New York. He and his much younger boyfriend were murdered in, what's typically described as a robbery gone wrong. So why? That's who he was. He died at 47. But I guess the main reason was that I was one of the 14 people in the United States who watched Hank every week. I was mad about the idea of going to college. There was no history of that in my family. My father had left school at the, in the 20s after the 8th grade, and my mother finished high school at night. I was desperate to go to college, and my favorite show was College Bowl, which was a quiz show based on a football game, which ran for years and years. And I used to watch this, and I suppose that, some pubescent part of myself thought Coleman was sort of cute. Although why I wasn't watching the Wild Wild West, I don't know, which strikes me as much more fertile material for a pubescent male in 1965. But I watched this all the time. And then, weirdly enough, he was murdered on the day my father was buried. I was coming home from Eastern Long Island, where he was buried in a veteran cemetery. And while I was crossing over into Manhattan, these three guys, the guy who did the shooting and the two who masterminded, if you can use that term for an absurd crime, while they were planning it under the bridge. So, New York 1980, there were still so many murders, so much crime. It came and went in the space of a day. And he had been so long out of show business that the New York Post headline was "Art Dealer Found Slain." And he gave a dinner party that night. I interviewed a couple of people who were at it and were still around when I started writing this book. They didn't even know he'd been in show business. The apartment, the conceit was that everything in the apartment was for sale. It was like where he lived, but it was also a showroom. But they said there was no, show business memorabilia or anything you might expect from somebody who'd been on Broadway and even been in TV for a while. And so it stuck with me. And it was a very long answer. And I squirreled away material for a number of years. I started writing the book in 2008 and then gave it up for 10 years to write this long political trilogy, and then went back to it a few years ago.
I actually want to read this one little paragraph where you're describing that dinner party, because it stuck with me as a great description. Before another 5 minutes went by, we were all consuming a lot of delicate, inventive Chinese food, and the conversation felt fitfully normal. Still, I would have been more comfortable with a couple of women there, not Dolores Gray necessarily, just anyone to lessen the predictable grind of double entendres arising from what the next day's New York Post, in a rare burst of accuracy, would call an all-male dinner party. So that's a great description of the gay male dinner party, full of double entendres.
As I tell somebody, if you want to know the difference between the New York Post and the Daily News, I believe the New York Post said that Coleman was found nude from the waist down, whereas the Daily News said he was found naked from the waist up. So I said the Post, would always push things a little bit further in the loose direction.
Is it the Daily News or the Post that had the famous headline, "Headless Body and Topless Bar"?
That was the Post.
That was the Post.
Yes.
Okay.
The story disappeared very quickly, and they didn't find the guys they put on trial for quite a while. What Jamie was just reading was that was the voice of Matt Leonetto, who's a fictional character, a Broadway pianist, and who is supposedly new Coleman, and he narrates these alternating chapters, which are set in 1980 and deal with the murder investigation, and go up through 84. beginnings of AIDS and so forth. And then the other chapters are these third-person biographical chapters, which show Coleman's show business career, which was really marked by just incredible aggression. I mean, he was, Sammy Glick of What Makes Sammy Run. He made him, sort of look like this gentle. Somebody once recently described some villain saying that he was so bad he made some other terrible villain look like Ted Lasso. So if I can steal that comparison, Coleman made Sammy Glick look like Ted Lasso. He was just hyper aggressive. I interviewed his own brother, who told me that his first wife, the brother's first wife, Phyllis Rabb, who was an agent with William Morris, once told him, your brother would fuck a snake if it got him a job. And and his brother loved him, was quite protective of him in the interview, but these things just necessarily came out because there were always these stories about him. And I've heard from a lot of people, the book came out a few months ago, and these people come out and, well, I have my Dick Coleman story for you, and they're usually of something that was not terribly pleasant.
You interviewed a lot of people for this book, and it sounds like you did a lot of research, maybe more than you've done for some of your other novels or not. Could you tell us about what the research process was like?
Well, it was a different kind of research for me because, mostly I've written about politics to a great extent. And I like popular culture. I like show business. And my partner was so happy that I was writing this book instead of, oh God, not another novel, set in the Reagan White House or something. But finally, some names I can enjoy.
That was show business too,
Yeah,
in its own way.
Well, yes. And but I did. I started sort of seriously researching this book, as I say, about 2008. And it was a good thing too, because a lot of people who knew him, were getting on. And I interviewed Robert Osborne, the head of TCM, who had been Coleman's roommate in the late 1950s in Hollywood. And he had lots of insight into Coleman himself, as well as to that kind of echelon of show business.
Is roommate a euphemism you're using in that?
Yes, it is a euphemism. And he had some unsurprising stories about Coleman. And I then set the book aside for 10 years. One of the best interviews I had was Carol Cook, a comedy actress who only died several months ago. She had flaming red hair, and she was a protege of Lucille Ball. And Carol Cook and Dick Coleman and Robert Osborne, who started life as a performer, started his career as a performer, they were all part of a workshop that Lucille Ball was running in the late 50s at Desilu to sort of bring along comedy stars. So Carol, when I interviewed her, was a mere 95, and sharp as a tack, a lot of fun, had really good stories, also very insightful into Coleman's personality and nature. And, the people at the dinner party, and then a lot of people who knew people. I mentioned Dolores Gray. She was dead long before I started the book, but I talked to a number of people who knew her well, and they would tell me stories about her. During one of her last hospitalizations, she was being wheeled through on a gurney through the hospital, and this one orderly said to another as they were wheeling her, "This lady was a movie star." And they didn't know who she was. They were far too young. And Dolores kind of like lifted herself up from the gurney and said, "A great star." Kay Ballard, I interviewed via the telephone, and I sort of got to a lot of people just in time.
Was there a section on Dolores that you wanted to read? or should we do that
one-
later? Or
Just to give a sense
Yeah.
of who she was.
Yeah.
She was
she was another name I didn't know, and I had to
Yeah.
look up.
Boy, you're gonna have to turn in your gay card. That let me see. I think I can find this. This is a scene early in the novel after the murder, when Matt, the fellow whose voice Jamie was reading in, the narrator, he is having lunch with Dolores Gray, Dick Coleman's business partner, and her career too was. She had a lot of setbacks, a lot of disappointments, as well as some high spots. But the disappointments were, as with Coleman, what really rankled. So this is Matt talking. I began to wonder if we'd even talk about Dick's violent death. Maybe we'd skip it entirely, and the conversation would keep hovering around her career, whose death had been less violent, but still something painful and premature to its victim. She'd almost always gotten reviews that pointed out her superiority to the stuff she was stuck in. There was no doubt she'd had a lot of bad luck, and her face had never been her fortune. It was longish and a little horsey. Her nose had been surgically overcorrected in a way that added to the general difficulty. Even in the table lamp's forgiving peach light, I could see she was trying to hide her bad complexion with too much makeup. Movie directors who loved her voice and pizzazz tended to doll her up in crazy costumes almost as a kind of camouflage, or they kept her in the background, as in Mr. Skeffington, her first film, where she had a little turn as a nightclub singer, and sometimes they kept her out of sight altogether, like when she dubbed Marilyn's singing voice on the soundtrack album of There's No Business Like Show Business. Did you really lose Mame to Angela Lansbury? True, I didn't have much of a segue for this, but I could tell that during the pause in our conversation, she'd been mulling over her disappointments. Cupcake, I lost My Fair Lady to Julie Andrews.
The object of Dick's lust or affection or pining, longing was an actor, in your book is the actor Kenneth Nelson, who will be familiar to most people as part of the ensemble and the boys in the band. He was in the original theater production of it
Yes.
and the film as well.
Yes.
But they had starred together, was it in 17?
Yes, as teenagers.
As teenagers. Now did you invent this relationship between the two of them?
Yes,
Yeah.
entirely.
Can you maybe explain that?
Everybody I talked to who had known Kenneth Nelson loved him as much as they were sort of made to cringe by Coleman. And but their careers, I discovered, had sort of intersected at various points. They'd been in 17 together. Then there were two tours simultaneously in the US of a musical called Half a Sixpence in the 1960s. And Kenneth Nelson was doing one of them and Coleman was doing the other. And then it looked like Kenneth Nelson was going to break through in show business. He was nominated for the Golden Globes Most Promising Newcomer, even though he was, 40.
This was for
Boys in the Band. And yet, that was kind of it. I mean, that was being cast in a gay role, even if you were gay in 1970, was not a good career move. And so he went to England and he did musicals and did theater over in England. But I invented this kind of mad, unrequited love that Coleman develops for Kenny, as if the sort of if it were a Western black hat and white hat or something, the good guy falling for the bad guy, and that sort of everything sort of turns on that, but the emotional dynamic is fictional, and the way in which that helps to explain the murder is also fictional.
So I first became familiar with your work by reading Fellow Travelers, and I think that's probably your most well-known novel, maybe. It's being made into a television show, as David said, which is probably the greatest evocation in fiction, I think, of what it was like to be gay in this city in the 1950s during the McCarthy period. And you're covering a similar period of time in your book, but in Hollywood. And I'm curious, what sort of similarities or differences do you think existed between those two worlds in terms of homosexuality? What was it like to be gay in this town and in Hollywood, in the business of Washington and politics versus the business of entertainment? There's this fascinating character I wasn't familiar with, Mike Connolly, who was a gossip reporter for the Hollywood Reporter, kind of like a Walter Winchell-esque figure,
Yes.
very unscrupulous, sort of, he had like a favor bank, and he would out people, or he would behave in very,
Yeah.
very unscrupulous ways, but was himself a closeted
Yes.
homosexual. He's a fascinating character I wasn't familiar with. Maybe you could talk about that theme in both of these
Yeah.
books.
He, Mike Connolly was the subject of a very good biography by a fellow named Val Holly, who used to live in Washington. I think he lives up in New York now. And it's exactly the character you're describing. And I think there were a huge number of overlaps between Washington culture and Hollywood culture. I mean, you had to have your beard out in Hollywood if you were going to get on in your career in show business, the same way in Washington you had to have your beard if you were going to win your next election, and so forth. You were prone to blackmail. And I think probably the chief difference was that the sheer numbers of gay people in Hollywood, proportionally, that was much higher than in Washington, D.C. I mean, you had, an enormous gay population in Hollywood: actors, writers, dancers, choreographers, costumers, makeup people. And so in that sense, I think it was even more wicked and absurd for that to be the culture. And the consequences for being openly gay could be equally brutal, the way they were in Washington. But it was it was make-believe piled onto make-believe in Hollywood. There was this fake gay culture that you had to go along with if you were going to stay in the business of all the other make-believe.
In terms of the structure of the book, it's, as you said, it alternates between the first-person narrative of Matt in the present. I mean, it's written in the present tense, which is really the early 1980s. And you alternate between that and then the third-person narration going back 30 years to the beginning of Dick's career, and you go back and forth, and it's very propulsive the way it works, because it really pushes the story forward. And I'm curious how you came upon that structure to alternate between these two voices, and was that new for you, and what was kind of the thinking behind that?
It's the only novel I've ever had that literally has two typefaces. There's one typeface when Matt is talking in the first person, and then another typeface when we're getting Coleman's third person story. This book evolved a lot, partly because it sat in a filing cabinet for so long. And by the time I came back to it after those 10 years, I started thinking about it very differently. Matt was originally supposed to be this kind of very sad Nick Carraway figure who's just a functional character. He was going to be the character that presented Coleman to us, and Matt was going to be very unhappy and lonely in his Manhattan Plaza apartment. And I just couldn't stand this after a while, and I thought, I've got to give him a boyfriend. I've got to give him a life. I've got to give him a plot line. So it was really two stories. It became two stories, and there was this character, Devin Arroyo, who works as a clerk in the police precinct, the 19th precinct on the east side, that was responsible for investigating the murder. And this fellow Devin was supposed to come and go in the space of a paragraph or two. But I hate this because it sounds like I'm giving one of those horrible creative writing classes that I don't even really believe in, where they say, sometimes the character runs away with the scene. And Muriel Spark in one of her novels says, "I don't let my characters cross the street without my permission," and I tend more toward that school. But Devin had this sort of mouth on him, and I thought I want to use him more. And before you knew it, he and Matt became an item in the book and developed very much their own plot line and a much more sympathetic figure than Coleman, and a much more sympathetic story. It was too much, really, in a way. The Coleman story has its sort of dark comedy to it, but it was even with Dolores and characters like that, I think it was just too grim. And even though Matt is terribly shadowed by AIDS, which is beginning in New York, nonetheless, we're far enough along so that he can have really a much happier life, or at least part of it, than Coleman did.
Yeah. You mentioned AIDS, and a couple months ago, you published a selection of diaries that you kept while you were living in New York. Were you living in Manhattan Plaza as well, or nearby?
No.
Okay.
I was living over near the UN.
UN, right? Yeah.
I had to be close enough to Grand Central because I was still teaching at Vassar, and I was
Okay.
sort of commuting up, and my life was the train. I didn't want to have to ride the subway once I got home.
But you published this selection of your diaries, which I encourage everyone to go look up, because it was really moving, and I really felt like I was there in that, like I was reading a report from a war zone almost, because you were writing about what it was like to be a young gay man in New York at the epicenter of this. And I'm wondering if you could maybe reflect on the connection maybe between those diaries and how they impacted the novel.
Yeah. I was a semi-young man. In most of those diaries, I was in my early to mid 30s, and
Still young.
was settled. I mean, I was getting a little traction as a writer, and I had a tenured job. I wasn't, bopping around like a kid struggling to be a writer, which I didn't have the guts to do when I was 22. But I was struck in many ways by how I was living my 20s and my 30s. I was suddenly there, wide-eyed in Babylon. I had moved from Poughkeepsie when I couldn't stand it anymore, and so forth. And so in many ways, they read, I think, like the diaries of a person who was younger than I actually was at the time. But I had never read them in 35 or plus years. But in 2020, I was getting ready to get rid of my papers. And then these diaries are very voluminous. There are about 150 volumes of them. But all the other papers a writer accumulates: manuscripts, proofs, letters, correspondence, photographs. And it all went to the Library of Congress in the fall of 2021. But while the papers were being appraised, I transcribed about 100 pages of material. And I picked the 80s at random because I figured, well, it's far enough back.
When
A lot
did you
of people are
start
gone.
these? When did the diaries begin?
In the 70s when I'm in college. And so I was struck reading these diaries by this manic quality that they had. I'm happy to be in New York. I just jogged past Jackie Kennedy at the reservoir, and all of the wonderful things about New York. And I'm getting somewhere as a writer. I've got books coming out, and I'm very, very happy. But every second or third day, there's some anvil that drops on me. A friend has gotten sick. I'm afraid I'm going to get sick. And I had a very particular reason to think I would get sick. And I'm trying to push that out of my mind all the time. And then the next day I'll be very happy again, whatever. And that was what struck me when I read them. Aside from the documentary aspect of them, I mean, there are a million things about the early years of the AIDS epidemic, that are in them that, which I think was probably the thing that most interested the Library of Congress in the diaries.
Well, they're interesting because they're most AIDS literature that we read is from activists, people like Larry Kramer, or so it was interesting to read them from someone who wasn't a part of that milieu. Personally, I found.
I mean, I was really selfishly trying to live my life. I was not out in the streets protesting. I was, I wasn't. I mean, I had many conservative political opinions, but obviously on those issues, gay rights issues, AIDS issues, I did not share the, prevailing opinions of, the elected powers that were at that point. But, I was trying, I mean, my friend Greg Ullman comes and goes in those diaries a lot. And I sat down with him last fall when I was getting this stuff ready. And he said to me at one point, we kept on living. We were just trying to keep on living. And Greg was much more politically, attuned to things than I was. But there were a million little things that textured the era, which I wrote a book about diaries many, many years ago. And I think that's one of the real functions that diaries have. I always tell people who are writing historical fiction, don't read that much about the period, sort of eliminate the historical middleman and read more from the period. Read the newspaper, read diaries that people wrote, read letters that people wrote. And there were things that, amidst all the horrifying stuff, there were things that made me laugh. One day, my friend Doug McKay comes over, and Doug was a volunteer at GMHC, the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And if you were of a certain age, you will remember that their #1 slogan, which you would see on condom wrappers in bars, you would see it on billboards, depending on what part of town you were in, was on me, not in me. Very effective. Makes you think. On me, not in me. And Doug, again, a much better citizen than I was. He was a volunteer at GMHC, and he came over for a drink one day, and he had just come from the GMHC offices. And he said, I had to use the men's room at the GMHC offices. And he says, do you know what the sign above the GMHC toilet says? In order to keep it clean, it says in me, not on me. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff that, diaries can be replete with. And
my understanding is you're going to be having a book come out of these diaries. Is that true?
I am. My editor at Knopf, even before they ran in the magazine, when he heard that this was happening, he said, "You want to do a book out of these?" And I said, "Yeah." I think I'd always wanted to get a book out of them. And before all of the stuff was trucked away to the Library of Congress, Bill and I, my partner, we went about the very laborious business of scanning these diaries. So it's like 3 million words on one thumb drive. So I'm working off that with my much larger handwriting from those days.
There's another character I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, which is Lucille O'Ball. And maybe you could talk about Dick Coleman's relationship with her. And what is it like writing fiction and dialogue and character for someone who's so indelibly imprinted in everyone's mind? I mean, I didn't grow up watching her. Well, I kind of did, because she was on Nick at Night, right? So we all know her. We all know her public face, right? But there was this very different woman behind the scenes. And how do you get at that?
Well, I remember. I mean, I was born 1 month after Little Ricky was born on national TV. I think that was the cover story in October of 1951, the early weeks, and I came along a month later. So I knew Lucy as a rugrat, and she was already in reruns in the morning when I was in elementary school. And it's true, she's so famous, and that it's really hard. And sometimes I would avoid those characters. You mentioned I tend to write about minor characters, even when I'm writing about big political events. I mean, I wrote a novel about the couple in the balcony with the Lincolns on the night of the assassination. And one of the things I did was keep Lincoln out of the book, because just writing dialogue for Lincoln, it just, I tried it, and you could sort of feel dry ice and Raymond Massey entering the room at the same time.
Unless you're Tony Kushner, of course.
Right.
And then it's,
So, but Lucy, I had to, because she was a pivotal figure in Coleman's life. This workshop was a very big deal. And Carol Cook in her 90s told me lots of interesting stuff about Lucy, how Coleman perceived Lucy's vulnerabilities, which were considerable at that time. At the time she ran the workshop, she was getting her divorce from Desi Arnaz and was very insecure, knew very little about music. And there was going to be a big musical component to this show that the workshop was putting on. And Coleman, who knew quite a bit about show music, he knew how to kind of get to her. But she was tough, Lucy. And there's one really tough scene. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book, where after she's kind of on to Coleman and he goes to visit her backstage. She did a musical in New York at the very beginning of the 60s called Wildcat. And she sort of lets him have it. But she's not that present in the book, but I couldn't I couldn't run away from her the way I ran away from Lincoln.
Did you see Being the Ricardos, the Aaron Sorkin movie?
I did.
Yeah. Did you think that was a accurate portrayal, or?
I just Nicole Kidman as Lucy. I just don't know. I mean, it's Lucy was really embedded in me, as in most of the kids that I grew up in. I mean, we even had a 45 record of Desi Arnaz singing the theme song. Most people don't even know that there were words to the I Love Lucy theme song. And I used to go around the house. I love Lucy and she loves me. We're as happy as two can be. Sometimes we quarrel, but then how we love making up again. And I was a ham as a child and would sing this. And she was just huge. And she had tremendous business instincts, as did he. I mean, they were the television power couple. And the fellow named Todd Purdom, whom you may know, he is now writing a biography of Desi Arnaz. And I think that will be very well worth reading to anybody who's interested in that period.
And just one more question before we go to the audience. You write, I would, the kind of gritty New York gay underworld of the late 70s is really present in this book, and I'm curious if what sort of sources were you relying on to kind of evoke that? I mean, there's a lot in there about these hustler bars, the kind of places where distinguished older gentlemen would meet younger men and whatnot, and I learned a lot about that just reading this. I'm curious what were you relying on to evoke that?
Well, there was a novel one time called Wallflower at the Orgy, which was actually sort of more like my life. And I spent the 70s in libraries. I was a graduate student full time. But I mean, a lot of this research interviews, friends, slightly older friends, who managed to survive, who managed to live, had stories about these places. A lot of this stuff came up in the police investigation about Coleman.
Did you go back and read the trial records?
Yes,
to do this?
I saw a lot of the transcript, and I had the lead detective's handwritten notebook. I had.
Where did you find that? He still preserved that somewhere?
A lot of it was at the state Supreme Court, because there were many appeals that were filed by the shooter, and I got some of it through somebody I barely knew, but knew at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And I was able to get tons and tons of Xeroxes of things. But, and there was one, by the time I got to New York, some of that life was still there. One saw it a little bit, kind of as a tourist. To use another television reference, I mean, there's that, I think it's in that first episode of Mary Tyler Moore where she says, well, Mr. Grant, I've been around. And, Ed Asner looks at her like, I said, well, I've been nearby, and so things I knew on my own and things that my friends lived through, all of that.
Yes, so there's a microphone. Raise your hand, and there we go. Yeah.
Hi, I hope this question isn't too specific, but at one point in the book, is it Dolores Gray says something about how Barbra Streisand, one of the places where she got her start, was at a restaurant called Mimi's. And we lived for many years in New York, and that was sort of our go-to place. And in fact, I was just there last weekend. And is that true? Did you make that up, or is that true?
And I can show you a picture on you weren't toward the back, because they actually have a picture of Streisand, not performing at Mimi's, but I don't think she was there all that much. But she was there, and she did some appearances there.
Where is it?
On Second Avenue and 52nd. Yeah, it's one of the real survivors. I mean that.
That was the other thing I learned reading this book. Who knew the Upper East Side was such an exciting place?
I mean, we lived in the East 50s for a while,
50s,
and my place that I still have, this little studio, is in the East 40s. But when I moved to New York 40 years ago, there were still lots and lots of 5-story buildings, and there'd be a restaurant on the bottom. And I'm not sure there's any retail left in New York now. But even Second Avenue in the 50s is all high rises.
Who else? Don't be shy. Yes.
What does the title mean?
Up with the Sun is the only distinguished thing about Hank, that failed sitcom, was that it had a theme song by Johnny Mercer, which could not have come cheap. And the lyrics are sort of introduce the premise of the show about how this guy is working so hard and will do anything to get an education. And the first line of the theme song is, he's up with the sun, and he's, and then doing all of his odd jobs and so forth. I don't know how they managed. They must have thought they were going to get a hit if they went to Johnny Mercer for a theme song.
I was looking up some YouTube videos of Dick Coleman singing on YouTube, and there was a comment under one of them that described him as he was an almost good enough singer. He was an almost good enough actor. He was an almost handsome enough guy, but he wasn't enough to become a star. And that seemed like a very sort of accurate, explanation of why his career didn't, well, in addition to his personal qualities, that he just wasn't, tip top.
Robert Osborne was one of the first people I interviewed way back in 2008 about him. And I was very discreet in what I asked, and I figured he would volunteer whatever he wanted or not. And he had lots of insights into Coleman. And as I say, to that stratum of show business. And he said, and I never forgot this, he said, it's a myth that being impossible, having temperament, being a diva, that those are the people who succeed, that if you elbow your way through, the whole nice guys finish last thing. He says, it's really a myth. He says, it may be true at the very top legendary echelon of show business, the Betty Davises, the Joan Crawfords, where you're so big that you can get away with doing anything. He said, but Dick Coleman was quite talented and there were lots of things for him to do in show business. He said, but one of the reasons he flamed out is that he was impossible. He was just not nice and wasn't easy to work with. And so the next time there was a role that was appropriate, people would say, we don't need to bother with Coleman. We can find somebody else. As you said, there were plenty of other people as good that we could get. And he rattled off all these other stories. People like, I remember one of them he mentioned was Rhonda Fleming. He said, she's not really a great actress, but she's okay, whatever. And she's nice. And he said her niceness is one of the things that kept her career going. It was not a lack of monstrousness.
Yes.
When one fictionalizes a real life person, does one need to get permission from anybody to do that? Or is it a matter of having heirs or not having heirs?
Heirs really don't have much of a say in it. If you're gone, you're gone. You really can't libel the dead. And I mean, our mutual friend, to be redundant, as Dickens was, our friend, Christopher Hitchens, used to love operating in America because American libel laws were so much better than British libel laws. But
Someone who you fictionalized in your
I did, yes.
two books, right? Or one?
Hitchens
Just
appears in
Finale.
two, yeah.
Appears in two.
He's a big character in my novel Finale. And so, most of the people, there are a lot of purely fictional characters in here. Most of the real life characters are long gone. And there are a few people who are in under other names and, the usual business of they're refracted away from their real life basis so that they are fictional characters, really. But in terms of the dead and in terms of public figures in the States, you have a pretty free reign, or at least wide latitude. You're looking dubious about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if it's a novel. Well, you could.
Yeah.
Well, once they're dead, there's no who's going to sue. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, heirs don't have any legal right to.
And the thing is, too, there's something about writing fiction. I've noticed this over many, many years that because novel writing requires a certain degree of empathy, even if you're not making a first-person character with that character's own voice, even when you're writing third person, most of the time you're inhabiting the point of view of a particular person. It may still be third-person narration, but we know that we're getting the perspective and the thoughts of a character. And you do have to sort of figure out how to walk in their shoes. And though it's perfectly plain that Coleman was not the most pleasant person, I never really thought of him as a villain. And I don't think you can. In Fellow Travelers, I get this all the time about Hawkins Fuller. People say, oh my God, he's such a terrible guy. He does such terrible things to Timothy. I never really thought of him that way. He was,
Creature of his environment.
yeah. And even the first scene in Henry and Clara is John Wilkes Booth riding away from Ford's Theater on his horse. And it's all from his point of view. And, in order to sink into that, you do have to sort of empathize. And it's even, John Wilkes Booth, and you're thinking, that ankle must have hurt, when he was riding away. And you find yourself occupying him for a little bit.
Please. Maybe just wait for the mic because there's a video recording.
Since you mentioned Fellow Travelers, I don't feel too guilty asking you a question about that book rather than this one. I'm a kind of an amateur historian of Washington, and I read Fellow Travelers when it first came out, and then I reread it recently. And I actually went and I kind of checked some of your references, and I was very impressed with how accurate all of it was. But there was one that I was particularly interested in, which was where Joe McCarthy lived on Capitol Hill, because you give a specific address, which is where my dentist's office is. And I'd love, I'd love to be able to tell my dentist that his office is in Joe McCarthy's house.
You know, I don't remember the exact address. I mean, I haven't read the
Okay.
book in 15 years, but I think I would have picked the real address. I think it's
Yeah, I figured you
true.
probably did. I
Yeah.
just couldn't, I was looking through city directories. I never could find an actual, thing to
Yeah.
pin it down. But anyway, I think maybe I'll tell him that anyway.
Yeah, if you send me an email through my website, I'll see. I actually don't have the files anymore. They've gone to the Library of Congress, but something may
It's Fifth and C.
trigger something.
Southeast, yeah.
But yeah, and a lot of details about gay life in Fellow Travelers, where the bars were, things like that, came out of. I mean, Jamie knows infinitely more. I mean, if you want the real story of Washington in that period, read Secret City. I mean, Jamie's book is absolutely terrific. But one of the indispensable sources for anybody who writes about that period of gay life in Washington is the Mortimer and
Late.
and Jack Late. Is it Jack?
Jack
Late?
Layton.
Yeah.
And something more. Yeah.
Yeah, and they did this series of books, or a few of them, and Washington Confidential.
It's a pulp, a real pulp, right wing.
I have a
screed,
copy
yeah.
of that.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
pretty,
And they talk about where these ferries can be
Yeah.
found, and it's all in this kind of it's like being narrated by Jerry Falwell or something. but the information is actually quite accurate.
And gay
they-
people would actually use that to find the bars to go to.
And I mean, years later, they really did not know that they had made a significant contribution to gay history, because you just can't find some of the information anywhere else.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jamie, don't you know where Joe McCarthy lived?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't, off the top of my head. But
It's it's funny that your dentist's office is there, because in the famous speech by Senator Flanders from Vermont, where he really
Insinuates.
and he says, he dons his war paint, all these investigations that are going to root out all the communists, whatever, and he
it's the dentist.
yeah, he comes
That's
up
right.
with the scalp of a pink army dentist. So this is some kind of dental karma, I guess.
That's what launched the Army McCarthy hearings, was the one communist he could find in the army was an army dentist. So there's anyone on this side of the room? No?
I'll actually ask a question.
ahead.
One thing I really loved about the book was taking a trip through old Broadway and all old television, which we're in a moment right now when there's so much prestige television, and Broadway is also just expensive and huge. And it's kind of fun to take a tour through a moment when lots of popular entertainment was just a little trashier and cheaper. And I don't know, I guess, what do you think about that difference between that moment in Broadway and television, and what's going on now? Is that lost, or is it in a different form, that kind of ephemeral, trashy, but really fun entertainment?
It's funny, they still use the phrase the golden age of television to talk about 1950s live hour-long drama, Playhouse 90, the US Steel Hour, programs like that. But it was a very tiny slice of what was there. Newton Minow just died a few weeks ago. The man who had, I guess he was the head of the FCC under Kennedy, and he was the one who coined the famous phrase "a vast wasteland." And a lot of TV sitcoms were pretty awful. I mean, television drama today is it's doing the novel much better than the novel is doing itself. I mean, we watch these, 12-part seasons of things, and we watch them the way we used to read novels, a chapter at a time, whatever, and they have a real richness to them. But I don't go to a theater not nearly as much as I used to, and I never was a kind of Broadway fanatic, but my sense is that wit on Broadway has so given way to spectacle. These gigantic elephantine productions. And if you and all the songs, I mean, songs from Broadway don't become top 40 hits anymore. Whereas when I was growing up, the songs from Broadway, as soon as they were being performed on Broadway, that person who was the star of the show would be performing them on TV variety shows. You know, you'd hear Polly Bergen singing "The Party's Over," something like that. I think the songs, all of the songs are these loud anthems to the self now. I mean, every lyric is essentially, I will survive. You know, I'm better than you. You can't defeat me. Whereas so many of the songs were, aside from the brassy ones, there were all these beautiful plangent songs. So I think the Broadway musical has come down in the world, but I think television drama certainly has gone way up and come into its own.
There's actually a short passage that I wanted to read. So, asked Coleman, is that the enemy? He pointed to his parents' television set, visible in the next room. For you guys, I mean. He himself was immune to threats and confusion. He had things figured out. The cocksure display was by now so overdone that Matt Leonetto began feeling a little embarrassed for him. The question's above my pay grade, he said with a modest laugh. I just worry about all those book shows playing Broadway. Each one that goes up seems to kill off 3 or 4 reviews. And those are the real bread and butter for us piano men, not nightclubs, Matty, asked Nelson. So it just shows that even then, 60 years ago, artists, entertainers were afraid of the next thing killing off their business. I mean, today it's, you know, prestige television is killing off the movies and they're killing off books. You know, the Marvel film is killing off the medium budget film. And this is just a constant process, I think, in art that, you know, soon it's going to be TikTok videos are going to be replacing Netflix probably. And we're all going to be forced to watch 2-minute, you know, stupid videos on TikTok all day. But
I got the usual monthly author's email from Random House yesterday, and, you know, helpful hints for you as an author. And one of them was how to promote your book on TikTok. And I thought, no, I can be grandfathered out of that. But, you know, we were talking very briefly there about, you know, the resemblances between show business and politics, you know, and the old joke about politics is show business for ugly people. One thing that they do have in common is that nobody knows anything about what's coming. Just before the rise of this tremendous tremendous era of scripted drama on television, 15 to 20 years ago, people were saying that scripted drama was going to disappear from television. It was all going to be reality television, which was much cheaper to produce. And those were the series that were coming along. And, you know, now there are fewer and fewer of those compared to scripted television, which is expensive, but people find a way.
speaking of, and we'll end with this, I guess, when can we expect to see Fellow Travelers on television?
I think it's going to be it's going to premiere on Showtime, Paramount Plus, which are now joined, either the last week in October or the first week in November. I've had nothing to do with it. I've not seen a script. I didn't go up to the set. You know, that old phrase, you'll never get rich playing another man's game. I mean, I am amused that the character in the book, Timothy Laughlin, who is sort of based on me, a 20-year older version of me, a me that had been born in 1931 instead of 1951, is being played by Bridgerton hunk Jonathan Bailey. And as a poet friend of mine in New York said when they announced the casting, it must be just like looking in a mirror.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I guess we'll both be signing books in the back. Is that right? Or-
Yes,
Okay.
I want to thank you both. Everyone, thank you to Tom and Jamie. Tom, next year, if you want to bring Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey here, I'd be glad to host you, all three of you. Yes, we have books for sale from our friends at Little District. If you don't know about them, we're happy to have them as part of the book selling community in DC. They've been a good partner to us since they opened. Thanks again to the West End staff, and thanks for coming, everybody. Good night.